Could Jesus' disciples have accurately remembered what he did and said for 10 or 20 or 30 or even 50 years? Modern humans can remember things from decades ago, events, songs, memorized poems or verses, Pledge of Allegiance, and so on. Of course, some of Jesus' disciples were educated and could very well have written down notes of his teachings. But even if their memories were only oral, I'll share several factors why I think it's very plausible that their memories of Jesus' life and teaching could be accurate in the New Testament Gospels. First, I'll discuss their memory about his teachings, and separately from activities and itinerary and events. Students of a Jewish rabbi would be expected to able to memorize and teach his teachings to other people, at least in the same voice or gist as the rabbi after training, and this is what scholars call ipsissima vox, but also as much as possible memorized in the exact same words as what their teacher used. This is what scholars call ipsissima verba. So see the supplement for links about what Josephus said about this topic, about how students of a rabbi were supposed to memorize and be able to teach those exact same words. Many people have memorized much longer sections than Jesus' New Testament teachings, which are about 15,000 words, about 30 pages of text. Many rabbis at that time had memorized even the whole Torah of 300,000 words, or even more. Even I've memorized several pages of word-for-word content in the Bible, and I've never been in an intense 3-year rabbinic training like Jesus' disciples were, where they were expected to learn what he was teaching them. As another example, I remember my grandfather used to lead the family in reciting a psalm before each meal, such as Psalm 100 or Psalm 23. And even though I probably only heard it 20 or 30 times, and that was several decades ago, I could still recite the psalms he taught us, because it was repeated often enough to get stuck permanently in my head, and the Hebrew style of parallel poetry helps memorization, and so on. Of course, if you put something to music, it sticks even more. The first century Jewish culture was actually much more of an oral culture than ours was. They were not a TikTok or iPhone or TV generation. They didn't have Wikipedia or blogs or even newspapers. Memorization was much more common, and people were more used to remembering oral teaching. Next, Jesus taught likely in Aramaic, as we could see from the occasional Aramaic terms that are included with translations in the Gospels. So the Greek Gospels we have are already translations, paraphrases essentially, based on Jesus' original words. So we're not talking about an exact tape-recorded copy of Jesus' words, but rather careful summaries of his teaching by disciples who had studied under him and lived with him for 3 years. In many cases, these summaries could have been word-for-word translations of memorable single conversations Jesus had. In other cases, they would be paraphrases or condensed summaries of many hours of teaching. For example, the longest sections of Jesus' teaching, such as the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7 or Luke 6, or the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, can be read out loud in just a few minutes. But we know Jesus taught crowds all day, so these sections are probably condensed summaries of his teachings. This also helps to explain many small differences in the wording, because Jesus taught it one way in one sermon and then used different words in a different sermon in a different place, and the Gospels preserve the different variations of his teaching. Jesus' teaching seems designed for easy memorization, as makes sense for a Jewish rabbi seeking to help his disciples to learn his teaching. Jesus probably preached similar sermons over and over, so repetition day after day in different towns would be helpful for memorization. Also, that it seems that his style may have used repetition of topics within the speech, circling back with variations. If you look at John 10, John 15, Matthew 5, Matthew 6, you see this very clearly, and also in the dialogues recorded in the Gospel of John. Interestingly, the style in the book of James and also 1 Peter and 1 John have some similarities in this regard, circling back to the same topic with different variations. And notice that James was Jesus' brother, and Peter and John were Jesus' disciples, so they may have been influenced by Jesus' style. Jesus' primary teaching method was telling parable stories. That's both what we see in the Gospels, and also it says explicitly that he chose that method and he used it a lot. And this method was also used by some other rabbis. Stories are helpful for remembering the gist or main point while allowing small variations of wording that do not change the meaning. Think about stories like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal sons, the rich man and Lazarus, the persistent widow, the sower and the soils, and many others. If you've read those several times, you probably know the gist and you could tell it to other people. And imagine if you had heard it hundreds of times as Jesus went from town to town teaching. You could definitely tell. Next, Jesus frequently used object lessons. Think about the child in the middle of the group, the denarius coin, consider the birds, consider the flowers. Those are things he said, right? The fig tree, shepherds with their sheep, all sorts of object lessons that he would use as he's walking along with his disciples. Jesus' teaching was often connected with impressive miracles, as when he demonstrated that he had the power to forgive sins by first telling the paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven," then healing him so he could walk home. Notice that not only the miracle would be memorable, but also the teaching connected with the miracle. So you could remember the teaching from the event of the miracle. Finally, many of his sayings and aphorisms are memorable because of their pithiness and vividness. Like when he said, "It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven." Or, "Remove the log in your own eye before removing the speck in your brother's eye." Or, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." These are very memorable, very pithy, condensed sayings. So it would have been feasible for the 12 apostles to have memorized all the New Testament teachings we have, plus more. Not only Jesus' teachings, but also his actions were easily memorable for decades afterward. Consider this partial list of some of Jesus' miracles and other actions, and you can imagine that anyone present at some of these events would find them memorable. Raising the dead, feeding 5,000 men, 4,000 men, plus women and children, walking on water, healing the blind, the lame, the deaf, the lepers, casting out demons, cleansing the temple, probably twice, stilling the storm, and many more that are recorded in the Gospels. These would be, I think, pretty memorable if you were there. This is related to something which is called flashbulb memory. When something happens that is so surprising or personally significant that the whole scene is just firmly implanted in your mind forever, especially if you think back on it multiple times and tell others about it afterward. I can tell you exactly where I was and what I was doing 20 years ago when I heard about the 9/11 attack, and the older generation could tell you about Pearl Harbor or JFK's assassination or other moments of historical or personal significance. But, of course, I only remember a small snapshot of what it looked like from my perspective. Just certain details at that moment. In Jesus' case, if there were a dozen other people who had witnessed the events, and they all had this flashbulb memory, like, "Oh yeah, I remember I was there when he was walking on the water toward us," they could later years share their different memories of the events and put all those different memories together and have a more accurate account than just one single person's memories. This process of remembering things in a group by discussing each eyewitness's individual memories is called collective memory. And there's been a lot of research on both individual flashbulb memory and collective memory. A very important point is that Jesus made his disciples practice by preaching his message while he was still alive. They did not wait for decades to share their memories. This is kind of a common misconception, that they waited around for 20 or 30 years and they're trying to remember, "Oh yeah, what did Jesus say again back there 30 years ago?" Instead, so that's not the way it happened. Jesus first lived with his disciples for several months. Then he sent out the 12 disciples in pairs, and they were supposed to preach and share his teachings and heal the sick with his power. And then they came back, reported to him, he taught them some more, and then he sent out 82, the 12 plus 70 other disciples in pairs. So this provides a test or challenge factor to give them motivation to memorize his teachings carefully, because they were going to have to go out and share it themselves. Imagine if you went to a lecture and you knew that you had to share the same lecture content in front of many groups of people for 2 or 3 weeks afterward. You would be motivated to pay careful attention, maybe take some notes. Of course, if you had just heard the lecture once, it would be hard to remember all the points, especially in our modern data-overloaded, smartphone-driven society. But if you'd heard the same message or a very similar message taught repeatedly for many times every day for months, eventually you would be able to remember the main points and the stories and so on, and be able to share them with others, especially if you were with someone else going out in pairs to the different places. In memory terms, this might be called consolidation, converting short-term memories into long-term memories that you could pull out whenever you needed them. Also, Jesus always sent pairs of disciples so they could help each other out if one forgot something, and both of their memories were thus strengthened. Finally, Jesus taught his disciples during one more period, and then he was killed, and then he rose from the dead, taught a few more things to them over the next 40 days. Then there was a 10-day gap when Jesus was absent from them, and the disciples were thinking about, discussing, and remembering all the things that had happened recently. Then the church was started on Pentecost, and the disciples were teaching after that point every day in the temple and from house to house, according to Acts, primarily led by the 12 apostles who had spent the most time with Jesus. And of course, when I mentioned the 12 apostles, Judas had been eliminated. He killed himself, and then they chose a replacement for him. And so there were 12 that had been with him the whole time. During this time, over the next years, the oral teaching would have been standardized and consolidated as they chose the most important aspects of Jesus' life and teachings to emphasize repeatedly as they taught and traveled. Many of the disciples left Jerusalem when persecution started after a couple months when Stephen was killed, but the 12 apostles mostly stayed around Jerusalem for the next 10 years, as recorded by the church historians. Finally, after some of the apostles like James were killed, people started writing down the apostles' teaching, the same content that they've been preaching constantly every week for the past years. And so that's where the actual written content started. Now, it could be that some of them had written before that, like it could be that Matthew wrote an earlier Aramaic gospel, but certainly lots of records were floating around by the time Luke came and wrote his gospel.